What is going on, Diablo 2 fans? Dobrunsky here. In today's video, I want to break down what I think are the top 5 sleeper builds that have been introduced into patch 2.5 because of the introduction of Sunder Charms. So this video, again, will not cover builds like the Fist Heaven's Paladin, Blizzard Sorceress, Lightning Sorceress, Nova Sorceress, Armageddon, etc. Common meta builds that you guys are aware of, I'm not going to be discussing. I want to focus on some of the new sleeper builds that I think will change some of the endgame content and sort of shift some of the meta, but I just want to make some of the builds that I'm going to discuss in today's video maybe a little bit more popular, sort of bring them to some new eyes for you guys that are checking out today's video. Again, they're not necessarily the strongest in every scenario that I'm going to be breaking down, but they're either relatively cheap to build, have fantastic crowd control, work great on players want difficulty, or are very sort of AFK, like fun to play. They're not like piano string type builds. So I think this video is going to kind of encompass a pretty good build list. So again, let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree or disagree, or if you think I maybe missed any quote-unquote sleeper builds. But anyways, guys, hopefully you enjoy the video. Let's jump in. So kicking off this list, I first want to talk about the Holy Fire Dragon Paladin. This build was originally sort of classified as being too OP when patch 2.4 was first introduced, and it was initially scaled back, but then they ended up reverting the changes. I personally always felt that this build was fine because it does require 3 Sura runes, 3 low runes, and a Cham rune to really excel. So you're going to be investing a lot of wealth, but I found that in patch 2.4, it was really good at like cow farming or other areas where there wasn't fire immune monsters, but it would really hit a hard wall in areas like Chaos Sanctuary with Venom Lords. But Sunder Charms has changed that. Now that you can self-wield a very high-level Conviction Aura and then have the Sunder Charm to sunder monsters to remove their fire immunity, this build absolutely rips. You can farm everywhere, you can charge everywhere, it has great mobility, it can farm every single terror location, and it's not too expensive if you compare it relatively to like a high-end Javazon or Lightning Sorceress. The Infinity comparison to Dual Dragon and Hand of Justice really isn't too bad. Now in terms of the gear, there's a lot of possibilities outside of there's 3 fundamental rumors that you need to use on this build, and the first is the Hand of Justice weapon, Dragon Armor, and Dragon Shield. Past that, you can pretty much use almost any other gear combination you want. For your inventory, you could go max damage, attack rating, plus life charms to sort of boost your Zealing damage. You could go all 7 MF charms because you're basically almost one-shotting stuff when you're charging around. You could run really any mercenary setup as well. You could go Insight Mercenary, a Barbarian, even use a Caster Act 3 Mercenary. It really doesn't matter because you are just charging around everywhere. Mercenary can't even really keep up, which is pretty hilarious. Now in terms of how to invest your skill points for this build, it's relatively straightforward. You just want to make sure that you invest 20 yard points into Resist Fire, then 20 yard points into Salvation. That's because these 2 skills will passively boost the Holy Fire synergy from the rune words Hand of Justice and the Dual Dragons on your armor and shield. And then you want to make sure that you have 24 points into Conviction exactly, because 25 will be granted to you from Battle Orders buff. That will give you the maximum negative conviction resistance that you can get. Anything past that is just a waste of extra skill points. And really beyond that, you can kind of tailor the build any way that you want it to. It completely melts everywhere, every monster in the game. So definitely highly recommend you guys check out the Holy Fire Dragon Paladin. So build number 2 on my list is the Fireclaw Werewolf. Yes, you heard that correctly. I prefer the Werewolf over the Werebear variant. Now this build, with the introduction of Fire Sunder Charms and very good gear, absolutely decimates. You have very high level fire damage as well as very high level physical damage. But the biggest drawback to this build prior to the introduction of Sunder Charms was you would basically one-shot anything that wasn't fire immune, but then when you ran into a fire immune monster, you were entirely relying on your physical portion of your damage. Now you could kind of work around this and have decent clear speed, but now again with the introduction of Sunder Charms, you can apply full physical and fire damage to every hit. And then on top of that, this build has great movement speed from Feral Rage, as well as, depending on how you spec the tree, fantastic AoE from a much improved Armageddon. So this build actually does everything: good elemental damage, good physical damage, has AoE and movement speed. It doesn't require Enigma, so it's actually a pretty fantastic build in my opinion. Now, as far as the gear goes, it is a little bit expensive. We're talking, if you want to really achieve the best possible result with this build, the 3 pieces of gear that I recommend is Ravenlore for a helmet, Phoenix for a shield, and then Grief for your main weapon. The complement of physical damage and negative fire res from Phoenix with the raw hard-hitting damage from Grief, and as well as the negative fire res from Ravenlore, it just makes for a fantastic build combination. As far as your mercenary goes, typically I would recommend an Infinity Mercenary, although with that being said, you could use a Act 5 Plague Mercenary variant for a little bit more of a somewhat budget approach. It won't work quite as effectively because you'll be waiting on that low res proc, but it will go off pretty frequently and be a pretty solid build. Now in terms of the skill tree, there's definitely sort of two main approaches to this build, and I actually prefer the second, but I will cover both. But as far as summoning goes, I only recommend putting 1 hard point into Oak Sage and 1 hard point into Heart of Wolverine. You can use either one, so depending on if you want more plus life, obviously go with Oak Sage. If you want more damage, go with Heart of Wolverine. Now, as far as shapeshifting goes, I recommend just putting 1 hard point into all the prerequisites for Fireclaw, and then completely max Fireclaw. And then move to your elemental tree, max out Firestorm, Molten Boulder, because they're synergies to Fireclaw. And then I personally recommend to sink the rest of your points into Fissure and Armageddon to boost Armageddon's damage and overall duration of length. You could go the route of ignoring Armageddon altogether and just putting more points into Werewolf and possibly a Fury combination. That's a very good approach, but I genuinely find that it's better to, because you've already invested 40 points in the elemental tree, to then continue to invest into Armageddon. At least this is my personal experience. Again, let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree or disagree. But the Fireclaw Werewolf is now going to be a huge sleeper build in my opinion. Fantastic physical damage, fantastic fire damage, as well as AoE and movement speed. So it's definitely a great build, and I highly recommend you guys check it out. Next up, I want to talk about the Frost Nova Sorceress. Now, for those that are tired of Blizzard, if you're completely bored of that skill, you don't like Frozen Orb, you don't like the cooldown, Frost Nova might be the new skill for you. And out of all the builds that I've gone through so far and will go through in this video, this is probably the best budget-oriented build. It doesn't require Infinity, it doesn't require Enigma, Cold Mastery is very powerful, you just need a Sunder Charm. Now, there is a couple drawbacks with this build in general. It's definitely not a Player's 8 build, so you can't go rip through Chaos and Veil runs Player's 8 difficulty similar to Hammerden, but at Player's 1 up to Player's 3 difficulty, Frost Nova completely wrecks. It will obliterate everything, you get crowd control. So it's basically a Nova variant, but you get CC, or crowd control. You're just going to completely freeze everything, do very good damage, and you're not tied to, again, Enigma for teleport or Infinity Mercenary for conviction. Now, as far as the gear goes, if you want to completely maximize your damage, obviously Nightwings and Death's Fathom will be the two best options, but this build will work completely fine with a Spirit Crystal Sword, Spirit Shield, even a Hodo variant is completely fine. The only thing that I would definitely recommend is look into investing extra points in energy, as well as using the boots Silkweaves. That mana after kill is going to really help you sustain your mana. You can also obviously support that with an Insight Mercenary, although once you have a very high level mana pool, you could use other variants like an Act 5 high damage mercenary, you could go Reaper's Toll, etc. There's a lot of possibilities when it comes to speccing out your mercenary for the setup. So when it comes to the skill tree, the fire tree is relatively straightforward. I just put 20 hard points into Warmth. You can go the optional route of adding points into Enchant if you want to buff the mercenary's attack rating, although I wouldn't recommend it. When it comes to the lightning skill tree, your 1.1ers, so static, telekinesis, and teleport. There is also the option of using energy shield as a supplement, because Frost Nova and its prerequisites, there is definitely leftover skills. So if you want to take advantage of energy shield to counteract the negative cold res from a Sunder Charm, that is definitely a good option. When it comes to the cold skill tree, just put 1 hard point into all your prerequisites, and then 20 hard points into Frost Nova, 20 hard points into Blizzard, and then 20 hard points into Frozen Orb. And typically, I would recommend, now that it's changed with Sunder Charms, having 36 points into Cold Mastery if you can get there. That will ensure that every single Sundered monster will have a perfect negative 100% cold res, which is going to maximize your damage. Anything above that is going to be a waste of skill points, so if you can get it, I would recommend 36 points. But overall, guys, I highly recommend this build. There's definitely different ways you can optimize the skill tree, different mercenary setups, and it is definitely the cheapest build variant that I've covered so far in today's video. Again, no reliance on Enigma, no reliance on Infinity, good crowd control, and it's a very fun Players 1 difficulty farming build if you are tired of Blizzard and Frozen Orb. So the second last build that I want to cover in today's video is the Freezing Arrow Boson. Now this build, in my opinion, has the very best crowd control in the game. We're not talking about Holy Freeze slowing down monsters. We're not talking about Decrep slowing down monsters. We're talking about using Freezing Arrow and everything that's not a champion or boss pack, literally freezing the monsters in place for multiple seconds at a time. It is very powerful. And then on top of that, if you're using the Rumored Ice, you're granted a Holy Freeze aura, so anything that's a champion or a boss pack will be significantly slowed down. So it's a very powerful setup. It is definitely a high-end expensive build, but I think with the introduction of Sunder Charms, that the Freezing Arrow Boson might actually be ahead of the physical Boson variant, Multi-Shot and Strafe. Again, I'll have to do some testing to like really crunch those numbers out, but I think that this is definitely a build that you don't want to sleep on. If you're tired of Multi-Shot, you're tired of Strafe, why not give the Freezing Arrow Boson a shot? Now, in terms of gear, definitely high-end variants like the Rumored Ice in a bow and Nightwings for a helmet is definitely going to be your top-tier setup, as well as an Infinity Mercenary. But there's definitely cheaper bows that you can use early on to make this build shine with a Sunder Charm. So you could rock an Insight Mercenary, you could rock Insight in a bow, you could rock Harmony in a bow, you could rock Melody in a bow. There's a multitude of budget options. And again, there's high-end expensive options like Ice or Mist, but you can play everything in between. You're still going to get that insane crowd control, it's just your damage will be a little bit less. Now there's definitely, in my opinion, 2 important pieces of gear that you need to have on this build. The first is Razor Tail. It's going to help you get 100% Pierce. That is very important for chaining together freezing explosions. And the second is Silkwave Boots. I really feel like even though Freezing Arrow has been reduced in terms of mana cost from patch 2.3 to patch 2.4, it's still a very mana intensive build, so it's not a bad idea to have some extra mana after kill. Now when it comes to the skill tree, I definitely think Sunder Charms has changed how I would typically spec a Freezing Arrow Boson. So starting off with Javelin and Spear skills, I did not invest a single point. This isn't a weird Boson, Javazon hybrid, so I don't feel like it makes sense to invest a single point. When it comes to the bow skill tree, I put 20 points into Cold Arrow, Ice Arrow, and Freezing Arrow. Typically, you wouldn't invest 20 points into Frost Arrow because you don't really need the extra freeze length before Sunder Charms, but now that Sunder Charms have been introduced and you can freeze every single monster, I thought, well, why not take advantage of some extra duration of freezing? You can alternatively invest points into the Fire Tree if you want to, but it's definitely an option that I necessarily wouldn't recommend. And when it comes to the passive and magic skill tree, I put 100 point into Critical Strike, 100 point into Penetrate, 100 point into Pierce, and then I split my remaining points between Dodge, Avoid, and Evade. Now you could definitely invest extra points into Valkyrie, that's totally up to you, but I personally didn't really see the point. Now I definitely highly recommend you guys try out this build. It is just so satisfying to completely freeze monsters in its tracks and just see them shatter into ice cubes. This is a very fun build. Sunder Charms has made it stronger, and you definitely need to try it out. So the final build that I want to cover on today's video is of course none other than the Fire Druid. This build, you guys need to give it a shot. Sunder Charms have made it so much stronger. The addition of removing the global cooldown from patch 2.3 to patch 2.4 made the Fire Druid a lot better. You can now cast Volcano, Fissure, Armageddon, all independently of each other, and you're not tied down to this huge cooldown, which made the build a lot more fun to play. And of course, they did add a lot more physical damage, so you could cover the entire screen with damage, but unfortunately, there was a lot of fire immune monsters, so you're kind of relegated to farming specific locations. Obviously, Sunder Charms has removed that. And with very powerful rune words like Flickering Flame, Phoenix, and then expensive uniques like Ravenlore, you can now bring the majority of sundered fire monsters down to almost a negative 100% fire res with, of course, an Infinity Mercenary. So you can turn your like 6k Fissure, your 12k Armageddon, plus the 10k physical damage. It just absolutely destroys monsters. When I was farming Bale Waves, I would just make sure that I had an active Fissure and Volcano loaded for the waves to spawn on top of, and they would just die instantly. I could not believe how powerful this character was, and this is actually the build that I plan on playing for the launch of patch 2.5. Now in terms of gear, there is a multitude of different options, but some of the more common expensive meta options is Phoenix and a shield, Ravenlore for a helmet, Flickering Flame is also a great helmet to use as well if you can roll a very desirable base, but don't sleep on Fire Faceted Crystal Swords and a Plague Sword as well. Different combinations of Cleansing Aura, lower res procs, and just negative fire res or plus fire damage will make your build very powerful. Now in terms of the skill tree, it's relatively straightforward. For summoning, I just put 1 hard point into Oak Sage and then 1 hard point into Summon Grizzly. Those are the only 2 summons that I use. I don't really recommend investing points into the Wolves. You just don't have enough skill points with a fire setup to really make them survive. Now in terms of the elemental skill tree, you basically max Armageddon, Volcano, Fissure, Firestorm, and Molten Boulder. And then in terms of Cyclone Armor, I don't recommend using it. It's different with the Wind Druid. When you have a lot of different synergies, you can have a very powerful Cyclone Armor. With a Fire Druid, it's not synergized, so it just evaporates instantly. It's up to you, but I don't really think it's worth using. And then of course, for the Shapeshifting skill tree, you don't invest a single point. But this build, guys, very fun. You can play it aggressively, casting Molten Boulder and Fissure, or you can just kind of AFK, teleport around, having Armageddon rain down, and just plop a Fissure here or there. It's a very fun build to play, very AFK. It's very powerful. I definitely recommend taking it for a rip and cast Sanctuary or Bale Runs once you get a Fired Sunder Charm. It is an entire, just a blast to play. Other than that, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a long one, but I wanted to give some love to some of the sleeper builds that I think have been introduced into patch 2.5. Again, please let me know in the comment section below if you guys agree, disagree, you think I missed a build, you would tweak anything gear-wise or skill-wise. Any feedback is always welcome. Other than that, guys, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you guys on my next one. Peace out.